Hello and welcome to Beyond Today, the program that addresses the future of our community through conversations with people who are working today for a better tomorrow. In our last program, we talked about how we can nurture a healthy environment. In today's show, we want to talk about building an efficient infrastructure, about a vision for the use and treatment of water, sewer, and solid waste through the best technologies. I'm Ray Charmonte, your host for Beyond Today, and Assistant Executive Director for the Hillsborough County City-County Planning Commission. We will be talking today with three people about achieving good management and good practices in the delivery of utilities. Our first guest is Lucia Garsys, the county's Capital Improvements Manager. She is joined by Dan Ruskiewicz, a citizen from Carrollwood Village. Joining us later will be Baird, Deputy Director of the City of Tampa's Sanitary Sewer Department. Welcome to our show. My first question is, what is infrastructure? This is not a word that citizens normally use a lot, and it's somewhat of a mysterious word that we do hear, but I'm not sure a lot of people understand what it is.
And a bureaucratic word, if you will.
Yes, very.
Certainly Dan can speak to it, but just from my opinion is that it's essentially the foundation on which our communities are built on. And that can include the cultural, it can include the social infrastructure, and for me personally it really addresses the capital and the roads, the wastewater, the parks, the schools, the physical infrastructure, the physical foundation upon which we build our community.
I think that's a good analogy because I think people can relate to their home, and it's basically the foundation and the plumbing and everything underneath that you don't think about, but it's real important that it's working correctly. Dan, do you have something you can add to that view of infrastructure?
No, but I think it's a word that people don't use, but they're involved in just about every day. I mean, when they hit bumps in the road, or when their water doesn't come out the spigot, or when their sewer is backing up and so forth, they don't think of the word infrastructure, but that's basically what we're talking about, is the facilities and the I guess the facilities and the installations provided by the county and private industry too. I mean, when you think of it, electricity, telephone, so forth, all adds to the infrastructure that we use every day.
I think one of the problems is while we use it, we don't really see it on a daily basis, but when it breaks, we're aware it exists. We have a short film that we'd like to show that just covers some of the county's facilities related to water and sewer and solid waste treatment. If we can, I'd like to show this film now. This is one of the county's sewer treatment plants where water is changed into what we call recycled water for use in landscaping. This is one of the county's water plants, I believe. I think this is in Lithia. I'm not sure, but I believe this is in Lithia Springs.
Dale Mabry.
Oh, is that Dale Mabry?
Dale Mabry.
It is, okay, it's Lithia. Okay. Again, very massive things that people don't normally see. This is the chemical recycling area at Sheldon Road. This is our Falkenberg energy resource, which turns garbage and refuse into electricity, I believe. This is another solid waste facility. Prior to this, you saw where they recycle trees into mulch. This is the refuse area. Again, these are not locations that the average citizen normally sees. Thank you. Dan, I'd like to ask you something again. I know you're involved in management in Carrollwood Village in the sense of a private management company, but also as a citizen, and I know we have a lot of pressing needs in our community. What do you see from an infrastructure perspective as being this community's most pressing need?
Well, I guess everybody would look at roads and say roads are transportation in general, I guess, is pressing, but I don't believe it is. I think our biggest need right now is water. I mean, for years we've been going along, everybody's turned on the spigot, the water was there, and then as you know, several years ago we had a 5-year drought. And we started realizing that water is a precious resource, and we were having problems. People up in northwest Hillsborough County saw their lakes dry out, and there's a lot of feuding going back and forth about what we're going to do for water. And so I feel that water right now, and generating water, whatever source it may be, is going to be our most pressing need for the next 20 years and beyond that, because as we get more growth, we're going to need more water, and we're going to need more sources of water. And I think that's something that the planners are really going to have to work with and overcome. And I think it's a variety. There's a variety of ways of getting water, and I think it's probably going to be a combination of all those, which will probably be discussed later, that will solve that problem.
Lucia, from a government perspective, what do you think is our most pressing infrastructure need?
Well, following on Dan's point about the transportation gets a lot of play. It's a very high-price ticket item. The construction of roads is very expensive. Land acquisition is expensive. And clearly there is a need to improve transportation, but along with that I think there is the need to maintain and ensure that we have our standards for parks and libraries met. But going back to the issue that we started with in the breaking down, which I think is a very good analogy, is that perhaps one of our greatest needs now is the whole notion of maintaining our infrastructure across all the various component types. The road resurfacings, for example, are lagging behind. We don't have the necessary revenues to resurface the roads at the levels that we need to. There are many facilities that currently exist, parks, libraries, that need new roofs, that need new replacement of lights. It's maintaining the assets that we already have, and I think sometimes we lose sight of that because the glamorous part is to open a new park or to open a new road or widen a road. But I think in terms of our infrastructure needs, it's really one of the key ones that I would urge us to keep in our minds is the maintenance of existing assets.
I think that's a good point, because I know as people, the most exciting thing is not painting your house, but it is important that you do it, and I guess that's the analogy of maintaining our infrastructure. It's not really glamorous, but it does need to be done to prevent long-term problems. I'd like to go back to water a little bit. I know it's been brought up that one of the ways we can help the water situation is maybe using it in a different way. What ideas do you see out there that might also look at it from the perspective of maybe just using less in the future as a way of dealing with an infrastructure problem?
Well, one of the things I've been involved in for many, many years, and as a matter of fact, Carrollwood Village is the leader in this, is the Reclaimed Water Program. All of Carrollwood Village right now, with the exception of a couple subdivisions, is now piped for reclaimed water. And we actually started the program because the county didn't have the funds to go on with it was going to be a pilot program, and I went to most of the residents there and I asked them if they were willing to pay for it, and they said reclaimed water, and they said yes, and it evolved, and we finally got the program going, and now it's being used elsewhere. But I think what we have to look at is you can't look at water from a county or even a city or even a regional asset. It's a state asset. It's a national asset, actually. And you know, people laughed at me when I said, well, someday you may see a pipe going all the way from Tallahassee down to the Everglades, and people putting it in up one end and taking it out on another, and vice versa. If that happens, that may be a way. Reverse osmosis plants out in the bay, converting salt water to potable water. They use it in the military, which I'm familiar with, and it's a very expensive process. Reclaimed water, process that the city is going to get involved in. I'm just talking to Mr. Baird on that about using reclaimed water, recycling it back through the environment, and using it for drinking water. Now, it sounds terrible, but it's been used. It's nothing, you know, sanitary. It's an acceptable way of using water. But we're going to have to look at all these systems and put them together in some way. Obviously, if we used strictly reverse osmosis, the cost of water would be astronomical. So from a finance reason, we probably couldn't go that way.
Is that the only system to convert salt water to fresh water, is reverse osmosis?
There are other systems, but I'm not familiar with. That's the only one. I got familiar with that during my planning in the military, and this was one of the major problems that General Schwarzkopf had to contend with over in Desert Desert Storm water. And I was in Central Command prior to the Desert Storm, but we sent over a whole bunch of reverse osmosis barges, put them in the Gulf there, and that's what they were using for water for their airplanes and their equipment and for drinking. So it is a way, but it's an expensive way. The other way is to try to store storm water in some method that it could be reused when we need it. And I think that's a method that would probably be a cheaper way of getting water. And but we have to start looking at it now. We have to start developing now. We can't wait for 20 years and then decide then that this is what we need. It's something we have to prepare for. And if we don't, we're going to be in serious trouble.
One of the themes I hear regarding the conversion of saltwater to freshwater, maybe either of you know the answer to this, is there any environmental problems with that beyond the expense?
Well, one of the environmental problems, I don't know the extent of it, but I was on the EPA advisory committee and I talked to some environmentalists about this. It's the disposition of the salt that's the residue from the byproduct. And there's a great concern as to what they can do with that salt. Well, you know, salt has always been a commodity that's been sold. Maybe it can be recycled and used by, used by people. Or I'm sure there's some ingenuity there, and I'm sure we have enough scientists around that can resolve that problem. But that's one of the problems that could be created.
Is disposing of the residue. Lucia, you talked about other types of infrastructure in the community. What are some of the things in Hillsborough County, I guess from an infrastructure perspective, that have been successful, that have been tried, or newer technologies that we're using?
I think kind of reiterating the point that Dan raised, and that's becoming the theme of all this, is that there needs to be new ways of looking at how we provide the physical infrastructure to the community. And in terms of innovation, there are public-private partnerships, which is a heavily overused term, but there are ways of working with the community to provide certain infrastructure that may not be in place. For us, one of the examples that has just very recently been adopted by the board and embraced by the board was the construction of roadways in the northwest part of the county in conjunction with a mall. And in there, it truly was a public-private partnership where the developer of the major mall, the Citrus Park Mall, will be constructing public roads, and we will be allocating our impact fees for that project. Something new, something innovative, and the kind of exercise we need to be looking at as a model for the future, because the way we have been providing infrastructure in the past on a pay-as-you-go basis to accommodate all new growth just isn't there anymore. I mean, we need to start thinking more creatively about how we do certain things.
That's a good example of a creative situation. Thank you, Dan, for joining us. When we return, we'll talk some more with Lucia Garsys, and we'll be joined by Brad Baird from the City of Tampa. Thank you. Welcome back to Beyond Today. I'm your host, Ray Charmonti, and we've been discussing infrastructure. I'm here again with Lucia Garsys. Joining us is Brad Baird from the City of Tampa. Brad, I'll have the first question for you this time. Tampa's situation is a little bit different than the county in that the county relies a lot on new growth and providing new infrastructure. But in Tampa, you have existing infrastructure. You have roads and sewer and water. But what are some of the problems with existing infrastructure when you're trying to deal with redevelopment in the city?
Well, in the city of Tampa, we have some pipelines and other structures that are upwards of 80 years plus in age, and you can imagine the problems dealing with an old infrastructure that tends to fail or cave in unexpectedly, especially in the older sections of town. When redevelopment or infill happens in the city of Tampa, what we try to do is stay ahead of the game. And if, for instance, a sewer line is in an alley and we're putting in a large apartment complex, we'll try to construct a new line in the street before the construction happens for the apartment complex. Things like that to try to stay ahead of the game.
Is there any way that you can retrofit some of the old lines that might be cracked without actually tearing the line completely out and starting from scratch?
Certainly. We have performed several rehabilitation methods for interceptors and collector lines throughout the city that may consist of installation of an inversion liner, installation of polyethylene pipe or slip lining with what's called a fiberglass pipe, where you can install a liner that will in effect provide you with a new pipeline that will get you maybe another 70, 80 more years of life in that pipeline.
That does narrow the capacity a little, though, or really not significantly?
Typically not, because the new inversion liner and liners are slicker, and that allows for the flow to travel through the pipeline faster, if you will, and that makes up for the annular space that you lose when you slip a pipeline.
Now, in the county, I guess the problems are a little bit different. I would assume most of the infrastructure is fairly new in unincorporated county. So the problem, I guess, is more in keeping up. And I was wondering, do you feel pretty much new development is keeping up with the infrastructure needs, or how are we doing there?
Ooh, what a wide open question, huh?
Very.
We have a huge county. I mean, we're almost 1,000 square miles, and so providing the capital infrastructure, the physical infrastructure to it all, will require us, and very quickly will require us to quickly reassess of how we do that. A lot of it, Ray, will have to do with where development will occur, because right now what is happening as development occurs in pockets, not only is it the cost to accommodate the initial physical infrastructure, there is an operating cost that goes along with it. And so the arguments for compact development become very real as the revenues to operate facilities continue to decline. We don't have the revenues to, for example, to construct a fire station is probably about $1 million, close to $1 million to construct a fire station. To operate it is about $650,000 a year. So we're at the point where the threshold of balancing what we build that's new and how we're going to operate that and how we're going to fund the operating side of it is becoming a very real and delicate question for us. It also then begins to raise the question of standards. Do we continue providing at the standards that we've currently adopted and we've in the comprehensive plan? Do we have the same standards throughout the entire county? We have very different parts of the county. The city of Tampa is very different than some of the very outlying rural areas. So those, I mean, the questions of what's happening in unincorporated Hillsborough, I think, are very complex. And the layers, the funding layers, the growth layers, the political realities, all woven together just makes it a very challenging task for us ahead.
Well, I think one thing that comes to mind is all this is very expensive, and you bring to mind the idea of whether you try to use what you have again or build new, and it kind of, I guess, brings me back a little bit to the city, because I think the city can provide some opportunities for growth in the future that might help the county by not having to go out to new areas. But you do need that infrastructure, and I was wondering, of all the different types of infrastructure you have in the city, which is in pretty good shape and which might you need to enhance a little to get some redevelopment?
Until recently, the focus was on the wastewater treatment plant, which was expanded to 60 million gallons a day in 1977, and then we followed up in the mid to late 80s and started with an expansion to 96 million gallons, and we have now started up that plant, and so we're in good shape with regard to the treatment plant. Probably our biggest need is water, specifically potable water throughout the region, and that includes Pinellas County as well. And we are looking at different ways, different alternatives with which to recover the water from wastewater plants and use that water for turf irrigation, for industrial reuse, as well as augmenting surface water supplies with high-level treatment before it goes to a surface water supply, and then in turn treated again for potable consumption.
Now, this is something that the city's working on right now as far as reusing the water. They have a program or plan to do this?
Yes, we have a program called the Tampa Water Resource Recovery Project, and we are in the implementation phase of that program to look at the feasibility of taking the water and purifying it to the next level and augmenting the Hillsborough River Reservoir system, and then after mixing, it would become the raw water source for the Tampa Bay region.
Great, that's good to hear that. Lucia, kind of going at water at a little bit different angle, I know the county has been involved in this idea of reusing water. Can you explain a little bit how the program, we talked a little bit about Carrollwood Village, but I know it's more extensive than that. How far along are we?
There are various areas, and just before I begin, we mentioned in the first segment the Carrollwood Village example of the reclaimed water unit that had that was initiated by the residents to provide reclaimed water. I think, just as a note, that's another creative way. That's one of the alternative ways of providing some of the infrastructure that we need. Is there are certain communities that are willing to go the extra mile and to fund partially or wholly certain infrastructure needs that they believe are important to their particular community. So the Reclaimed Water Program, and as best as I can tell, because it's not particularly my area of understanding, but there are individual units that are created, be they subdivisions or several subdivisions, and they choose to pay for the reclaimed water lines that are built within their particular subdivision. There's a petition process, a public participation process that is underway before that actually happens. And then through that, the community identifies that yes, indeed, they're interested in reclaimed water, and then the county is responsible in part or in whole for providing some of the transmission lines and the larger lines. And of course, again, like everything else, the funding for that is very tight. But beyond that, it would be difficult for me to say whether or not we have more demand for reclaimed water than we have the ability to provide right now. But I know that it is becoming a very popular program, particularly in those areas where there is a potable water shortage.
Well, I think that is an example of another creative solution, and water has been talked about throughout this segment as being a very important infrastructure. Brad, dealing with the city, I know there are some areas that are being redeveloped. Of course, we have New Tampa, which is probably new infrastructure, but in the existing city, are there pockets that are popular for redevelop where the city does have infrastructure, existing infrastructure?
I would say the Hyde Park area certainly has been popular for redevelopment. Ybor City, of course, has been popular, and the city has been busily replacing lines, lining lines, making sure that we have the stormwater facilities necessary to handle that redevelopment.
So they're clearly planning ahead then to encourage some of the redevelopment to occur in the city.
Yes, a development is a good thing. I think Mayor Greco has done an excellent job in attracting development to the city.
Well, I think again, the theme that came out most in infrastructure was the water situation, and I think that's probably at the forefront of our infrastructure needs now. I'd like to thank today's guests for talking with us about building efficient infrastructure. Please join us next month when we'll talk about another of our community's visions, recreating thriving neighborhoods. I'm Ray Charmanti. On behalf of the Planning Commission, I thank you for thinking beyond today.